I will never forget that evening when we received the order. We worked for an elite escort agency, not street girls, not for just anyone. Our clients were wealthy, influential, and paid sums for a night with us that ordinary people could only dream of. 9 girls, for a private villa. No refusals. Everything top tier. That's what our curator said, giving a dry smile. We knew what that meant. Be perfect. Forget our names. Adapt to any whim. The dressing room was cramped. Kshusha was fixing her lipstick. Margot was pulling on her stockings, and Anya nervously smoked, her eyes glued to her phone screen. They say they're from Moscow. Oligarchs, she muttered, blowing a strand of hair from her forehead. What's the difference? They pay. That's all that matters, Lara replied, raising an eyebrow. We had worked with the most spoiled clients, politicians, businessmen, celebrities. But something about this order felt different. A note of unease that we tried to ignore. A black bus arrived at midnight. The driver was silent, his icy eyes visible in the mirror. We boarded one by one, clutching our purses filled with powder and expensive perfume. The road was long. First, the city lights, then the occasional street lamps, and finally, only darkness beyond the windows. The forest grew denser, trees intertwining into a massive black wall, like a prison. When the bus stopped, a man was waiting for us. A tall figure with a smooth face and emotionless eyes. His suit was perfectly tailored, and his gaze carried an eerie emptiness. He led us along a gravel path where the moisture from the recent rain glistened under the lanterns. The villa was enormous, marble columns, massive doors, floor-to-ceiling windows. Deep, masculine laughter echoed from inside, rolling through the night like distant thunder. Inside, the air was thick with expensive whiskey, Cuban cigars, and the rich scent of leather chairs. A heavy, spicy haze lingered, making my head feel light. The walls were adorned with paintings, abstract, unsettling, with blurred figures and dark strokes. The music was soft. Something old, jazzy, like a relic from another time. We couldn't see them at first, only silhouettes in the cigarette smoke. They handed us champagne, and our curator gave the faintest nod, a signal to begin the game. I took the glass, but my hand trembled slightly. There was something off about the atmosphere. Too quiet, too perfect. Everything was arranged like a stage before a play. I glanced at the other girls. They felt it too, but smiled just as I did. We knew the rules. Refusal was not an option. The door closed behind us with a heavy click, and the room fell into a hushed silence. Music played somewhere deep in the house. Distant male laughter echoed through the space, and the fireplace crackled softly. 9 men stood before us. They didn't approach immediately, just watched, letting their eyes drift over us, studying, memorizing. I instinctively straightened my back, recalling our handler's instructions. Keep your posture straight, make eye contact, smile, even if you feel uneasy inside. Welcome, one of them finally said. A tall, lean man with sharp, predatory eyes. His voice was deep, calm, unnervingly relaxed. A silent servant poured champagne, offering glasses on a silver tray. Let's get to know each other better, the man continued. He sank into a leather armchair, crossed one leg over the other, and took a slow sip of his drink. The others followed. Some sat on the couch, others remained standing, but none of them took their eyes off us. I took a glass, but didn't drink. There was something off about this night. Margot was the first to step forward, her delicate fingers tracing the stem of her glass, a faint smile playing on her lips. She was always the most confident among us. "How do you like our names?" she asked, letting her gaze drift over the guests. One of the men smirked. "We prefer when there aren't any," His voice was soft, but something in it hinted at something deeper. Xiusha gracefully perched on the armrest of a chair, her blonde hair falling over one shoulder. Her fingers lightly brushed the lapel of someone's suit, a subtle but deliberate gesture. Someone moved closer to me, his hand sliding down my back, just above my waist. "Relax," he whispered. The words were familiar, but for some reason this time, they sent a chill down my spine. The men moved with confidence, with no rush. They knew exactly what they wanted. Someone's fingers traced the curve of Anya's collarbone. Another man's gaze lingered on Lyra's delicate frame. Their movements were slow, light, almost imperceptible. Yet something animalistic lurked beneath their polished mannerisms. We were professionals. We knew how to play along. We smiled, responded to their touches, followed the rhythm of the game. But the game was becoming more real by the second. And somewhere deep inside, I already knew. This wasn't just a party, and this wasn't just another client. It seemed like the evening was following the usual script. Champagne poured into glasses, light touches turned into more assertive gestures. The men acted as expected for those of their circle, relaxed, with a sense of authority, knowing that everything was unfolding according to their rules. But there was something off in their gazes. When one of them ran his fingers over Xiusha's shoulder, his hand lingered just a little too long. When Margot laughed at someone's joke, the man sitting next to her subtly squeezed her wrist. Almost imperceptible, but there was something possessive in that touch. They weren't just enjoying the company of beautiful women. They were examining us, measuring us. I took a sip of champagne, but it tasted strange, heavy, unpleasant. Or maybe it was just the feeling. "Let's go outside," one of them suggested with a cold smile. "Outside?" I asked, trying to hide my unease. He just nodded, and his gesture was unquestionable. It was a command we couldn't refuse. The man beside me gave a look that weighed on me. He approached and offered us long, dark coats. But I realized it wasn't protection from the cold. We were ready for a game, but not this. Nevertheless, we obeyed. We stepped outside. The cold wind stung, and the rain had left wet traces on the ground. But we weren't dressed as we had expected. Their demands were soft, yet absolute. In the darkness of the forest, where we stood, there was no room for maneuver. Hearing only the squeak of rubber on wet earth, we followed them, under their gaze, in their shadow. The sounds of ATVs and barking dogs heightened the tension. We stood before them, feeling the heavy silence pressing down on our shoulders. The wind ruthlessly tugged at our hair, and the air grew thicker with every moment. We knew that something entirely different was about to begin, and there was no way out. We stood in the darkness of the forest, surrounded by sounds that were growing louder. The barking of dogs, the roar of ATVs, rustlings as if something was crawling along the ground. There was almost no wind, but the air was so damp and heavy that it felt like it was about to swallow us whole. One of the men, the oldest of them all, with deep wrinkles around his eyes, stepped toward us. His voice was firm and clear. "The time has come." He raised his hand, and behind us, the ATVs approached. One of them had a large, powerful dog beside it, black with eyes as cold as its owner's. We didn't move. We all understood that nothing in this house and on this land had been random. Everything that was happening had its hidden meaning, its algorithm. He looked at us, taking his time. There was no pity, no apology in his gaze, just an infinite confidence in his power. "You need to run," he said, looking us in the eyes. "Everything begins the moment you leave." I felt my heart beat faster. We didn't argue because we knew. This game was not just a game, it was a trial. For us. One of the men approached and nodded toward the ATVs. The dog started to growl, nervously, its gaze sharp and ominous. I could feel its eyes scanning us, judging us. We started to move, some faster, others more slowly, barely able to lift our feet. The men watched us, their faces expressionless like masks. Each step took us farther from the warmth and comfort. We were no longer on the bright side of the evening. We were now on the side where the hunt reigned. The dogs didn't stand still. They moved like living shadows, tracking every step we took. Their barking grew louder, and the noise from the ATVs no longer seemed so far away. And though we had begun to move, this was just the start. We still didn't know what we had signed up for. The darkness of the forest closed in on us from all sides. We ran, my heart pounding in my ears, and my breath grew heavy, as if the air here was thicker than in the city. The slender trees, which once seemed beautiful, now felt like obstacles. I could no longer tell where the beginning and the end were. Every step felt like I was trapped. The barking of the dogs grew closer. We could hear them tearing after us, their paws skidding across the ground, scraping over damp stones. They were fast, vicious, and judging by the sounds, almost a step ahead. I glanced at the girls. They were with me, but exhaustion was already weighing heavily on their shoulders. Xiusha was ahead, her feet barely touching the ground, moving with a grace I hadn't expected in such a situation. But her face was becoming paler, and I could feel how each of her steps was getting harder. The men were in no rush. This was their game, and they could afford to savor every moment. However, when I glanced back, I noticed one of them, the oldest with wrinkles around his eyes, still standing in the shadow of the trees. He slowly raised his gun, and then a shot. The deafening roar echoed through the forest, and I didn't immediately realize what had happened. Only when I heard the dreadful scream did I understand. It was Margot. She collapsed to the ground, her body jerking, and she began to scream in pain. In panic, I rushed to her, but she held her leg, blood pouring from it, bright and thick, contrasting sharply with the darkness around us. "Run!" she screamed, trying to stand. "Don't stop!" But I couldn't leave her. The other girls also slowed down, their faces full of fear. But they knew what to do. It was their instinctive reaction, just like mine. But we were already trapped. We couldn't go back, and ahead of us was only emptiness, where we knew even greater danger awaited. And then, by some miracle, I found myself in the water. The forest, leaving me behind, now seemed alien and hostile. I lay under the water, waiting until the sky began to brighten. First, it was a barely noticeable change, but then it became clearer. For a moment, I froze, feeling the water leave my body, and only the cold remained, seeping into my bones. Then I crawled out of the water, shaking, and dragged myself toward the trees, still sensing their distant gaze. The forest was dead. There was no birdsong, no sounds of insects, only the wind whispered in the treetops. I stumbled further, barefoot, chilled to the bone, with dried blood on my lips, and suddenly I saw a pit. Not just a pit, a grave. Bodies had been thrown in there like useless cargo. They were no longer sought after. The hunt was over. I knew they never left traces. This was their game, and we were just prey. But I still couldn't understand how I had survived. At dawn, when the light softly filtered through the forest, I made it to the highway. Shivering from the cold and exhaustion, I stopped a car. The driver was in shock, his eyes unable to believe what he saw. I couldn't speak. I just cried. In his gaze, I saw how he, not knowing what to do, just turned the car around and drove me to the city. When I reached the station, I told them everything. Everything I had endured until the shadow of the forest disappeared. But I knew. They would never be found. These people don't leave traces. They are hunters, and we were just prey.